Okay, good morning. First off, I guess, are there any questions or stuff that we should cover first before we get started? I don't hear anything, I'll assume that's a no. Okay, actually I got something to sort of cover. Let's see, I'm not sure if I actually explained this in this context. If I did, it's repetitive. If not, I should have done it. When I was mentioning last time, and I was talking about this whole issue of how Chinese identify and how this was construed by the sort of Anglo population on the US mainland, both as a positive in the sense that Chinese obviously had strong senses of family and there was a sense of responsibility to the group and stuff, which in Anglo American society is a big deal. But then, of course, in Anglo American society, it's always sort of juggled with this idea of the importance of individualism. What the heck is going on here? So what you had, ironically, was Anglo-American society looking at the Chinese and basically misinterpreting why they were doing something. They thought they were being good because they were good in the sort of, Calvinist Puritan sense, whereas the Chinese wouldn't know a Calvinist that ran over them with a truck. So the Chinese were just doing it because it was part of their cultural heritage and then part of the social value system is very strongly grouped. One of the side effects of this in a negative way, and you certainly see this a lot even in contemporary society here, is that in Chinese families, and by that I mean Chinese American as well as first generation, fresh off the boat Chinese, is that you're going to find a population that sort of has two aspects that show up a lot, both in what you might call counseling or social services, and also in education. And that's that this is not a group which is going to sort of on average, they're not going to go talk to a counselor if they have emotional or social problems. And the reason very simply is that as far as they're concerned, that person they're talking to is not part of the family. They can tell you till the cows come home, they're not going to say anything about it to anyone else, but they're not sure that's actually the case. Even if the counselor isn't going to say anything, someone might see them walking into that office or the receptionist might know them. So in Chinese society, this fear of the family being shamed by individuals, maybe even showing weakness would be a way to phrase it, is such that people would rather hide the problems that individuals have or even that the family has, rather than subject it to outside scrutiny, even if that's looking for help. So for example, child abuse and spouse abuse in Chinese families is almost non-reported. There's no way that they would report that to the authorities or even bring in a social worker or something like that to help with it. It's going to be buried in the family. Mental issues are very frequently buried in the family. The family will, and there's if you ever watch Hong Kong or Chinese soap operas, this is a huge scenario, and that also in Korean, I should point out, which have very similar value systems, that you hide failures, what are seen as failures or problems that family members have. The last thing you want to do is bring them up with the idea that you're going to, even if it's an expert that could help, you don't want that expert to know that your family has a problem. So you're going to avoid in any way, shape, or form bringing that expert in, because there's always a chance that someone will find out and it will get up into the gossip cycle. If on the other hand you just shut it down in the family, then it doesn't get in the gossip cycle. This also applies to education. If a kid's not doing well in school, there's enormous pressure on the kid. It's not a personal failure, and the family's not going to blame it on the school. It's going to be a family failure. The family didn't prepare the kid well enough. The family didn't provide enough resources. The family wasn't hard enough on the kid, especially discipline is a huge thing. A fair number of my nieces and nephews went to Iolani, and that's sort of a scary proposition to watch with Chinese students, because they have to get A pluses. They can't even get A's. They have to be the best in the class. And if you watch an 8-year-old kid who's having a hard time in math and they've been told they have to get an A plus, that's a kid that's under enormous amounts of stress. So it's very typical with Chinese and Chinese Americans, lesser extent the more assimilated they get. But even with Chinese American families that have, or say 3, 4, 5 generations in, the pressure to be successful in something that has public, which of course school does, because school is a public, public venue, and to a certain extent, it's public performance, that you have to be the best. Not necessarily in everything, but you have to be the best in at least one or two things, is absolutely critical. That's not a negotiable option. So the idea that you would use school as a way to like self-discover, or or various other sort of rhetoric things that, find out who you are, that type of whole thing in American society. Chinese just don't understand that. They don't buy it, and they don't see it. And if an individual tries to do that, the family will reel them back in line and sort of say, you're going to make your grandparents and the family ashamed of you if you keep this up. So the pressure to conform to family expectations is absolutely huge. Now, what that means, ironically, is this is why you see such a huge disproportionate number of Chinese and Chinese Americans as doctors, lawyers, and stuff like that. I had a good example of my own in-laws. One of the nephews, he was told as second son he's going to be a lawyer. So that by the time he was, halfway through high school, it was already decided by the family he was going to be a lawyer. And he did. He became a lawyer. He's never practiced. He's gone off and started his own business. He had no interest in being a lawyer. He hates the law. But the family told him he was going to do it. So he went through law school, passed with, one of the top in his class. And, they were happy. They could say, my son's a lawyer. They didn't care if he practiced law. But the fact that it wasn't his choice whether he was going to be a lawyer is very typical in Chinese society. And that's still the case. Again, my in-law side of the family, a fair number of the family is still in China. And there it's even more constrained. You're told from a very young age what you're going to be. And you're also told you're going to be the best. And so the pressures that Chinese students face in the academic world is absolutely enormous. My nieces, on average, through high school, were putting in about 4 to 6 hours a day in homework. They would generally get home for about 4 or something like that. And they'd be studying and doing stuff related to work school Monday through Friday till 10 or 11, and then on Saturday from maybe 9 till 5, and then Sunday maybe 3 or 4 hours. And that was all the way through high school. In fact, they were doing that through college. That's what they were doing through their undergraduate career. One's almost a lawyer now, ironically, and the other one's a very successful financial services advisor, whatever the hell you call it. So that's the way you do it if you're Chinese, and that's the pressure that individuals face. And so what it means, among other things, is if you look at Chinese, especially Chinese Americans who are brought up in that situation, their view of everyone else, which would include a fair number of you guys, would be that you're not necessarily performing to your top potential in the way that they think they have to. So what that does is it sort of reinforces the Chinese attitude of being in the group. The only people that they're familiar with that are going to be studying that much, I hate to say it, but most Chaminade students don't study 4 to 6 hours a day for their homework after school every day. So if you're a Chinese student, the only ones who are going to understand you, 1 are other Chinese, and 2 are going to only be family, because you're not going to talk about it to strangers. So this sort of insular, inward-looking connection system is really, really powerful in Chinese society. And it persists. I think in part because with Chinese Americans, you see this much more here than you do in the mainland, but with Chinese Americans here, I think what you have is to the older generations, there's still this enormous fear. And I think the one interesting thing about Chinese society, I don't think this changes how much they've assimilated. The fear of public ridicule, of public dissing, is so powerful that a lot of these pressures that are, sort of normative in Chinese society persist multi-generationally, really in really interesting ways. On the U.S. mainland, not quite as much. Chinese Americans on the U.S. mainland tend to be much more assimilated to sort of the Anglo-American point of view in some ways, though it's really sort of tricky to see. And then in part that's because they had the spill out of the Yellow Peril movement that so hugely slammed the Japanese, as we'll see in the next week or so. So it's important to remember when you're looking at Chinese, you're going to see them disproportionately lowly represented in things like kids who are discipline problems in school, who are doing poorly educationally, where families are having family crisis or individual crisis or abuse or something like that. You're just going to see them really low on the numbers. That doesn't mean they don't have it. It just means there's no way in God's green earth they're going to make any of that visible to the rest of the world. That's all going to be behind closed doors, as it were. Now, this makes them a huge problem if you're dealing with social services or a bunch of other stuff. especially in education. Chinese students, for example, in education would be much more liable to commit suicide than they would to be asked for counseling help, or much more liable to commit suicide than, ask for educational support assistance. Though they're less prone to that than Japanese society. That's in part, I think, because in Chinese society, suicide is not seen as a legitimate form of protest. As we'll see with Japanese, suicide is actually a legitimate way to complain about the way the world treats you. Chinese don't have that. Chinese suicide's an enormous embarrassment because that again falls back in the family. So it's a real family first world the Chinese live in. And it's sort of hard unless you actually experience it or you are familiar with it to sort of explain how pervasive it is. Let's see, last days. Okay, don't say what it is, but how many folks in class know what this word means, miscegenation? Anyone? Oh, okay, one person's got it. That it? Okay. It's not that you should know it. In fact, in some ways, it's probably good you don't know it. Let's put it this way. 50 or 60 years ago, everyone in this class would have known this word. Everyone at Chaminade would have known this word. And Jared has it exactly right. Miscegenation laws are laws that say that you cannot marry someone of another race than yourself. The majority of states, I believe, was 30 something, I can't remember exactly what it was, had miscegenation laws in the early 20th century. Mind you, it's not part of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. In fact, you could argue very easily as it was that it was actually against the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. But nonetheless, you have to remember that the United States is a religious country in the sense that it uses religious doctrine and also social doctrine to enforce a set of laws, which constantly gets us into trouble, as it does most societies. So in American society by the early 20th century, race was the defining way that people looked at each other. It hadn't been maybe 100 years earlier, and I'm sure there must be tons of books out there about this. I have no idea when or why. In fact, maybe no one's ever looked at this in this way. I'm not sure if anyone's ever actually analyzed why race becomes the way you judge others in American society. Slavery was always part of American society, but then slavery could be anyone. Native Americans were slaves, and when they killed them off, then they import Africans. So, slavery was just a rather grim economic way of dealing with stuff. But miscegenation laws and racism become really dominant by the late 19th century. And what you start to get are these really sort of terrifying concepts, which you still see with very much, sort of alt-right groups, with this idea of racial purity, which is really fascinating because if you ever look at it, racial purity is a very strange concept because it's almost impossible to find. First, defining race is an entirely arbitrary procedure. And then secondly, how you keep it pure. If you just sort of arbitrarily pick something, is it based on skin color? Is it based on heritage? What are you using as criteria? How do you prove it? And if you're one of the groups that's being told you can't marry and you want to, then why would you listen to it? So miscegenation is a really odd thing. By the early 20th century, the majority of American states had miscegenation laws. Now, one of the goofy things about this is what it meant if I marry someone, well, I guess I have, if I marry someone who's Chinese and I live in California back in the early 20th century, then that means that we'd actually be arrested for felonies. So we'd be put in jail because we'd married someone who was different than ourselves. Now, I assumed that the state would annul the marriage, but to be honest, I've never actually looked into what the mechanism was of punishment for miscegenation. And then, I guess after maybe 5 years, they let you out of jail. So these were serious felonies. I mean, this wasn't like, this was as bad or worse than nicking a bunch of stuff from a store. So it was equivalent to sort of second tier theft. Now, by the 1950s, 1960s, miscegenation laws started to disappear. This was one of the huge changes that occurred probably in the 60s through the 70s, which was a period of sort of, maybe one of the first strong periods of really sort of introspection in American society about the way the society was structured in terms of inequities. Most states got rid of their miscegenation laws. In most cases, these went to through the court system, and the Supreme Court had decided that there was no legal background in the American Code of Justice, i.e. the federal laws, that actually made miscegenation legal. So basically what happened is it went through the Supreme Courts, and they just said, nah, you guys can, you guys can want it, but you can't make it it's not a federal statute. Though there was a push apparently in the 20s to actually make it happen, which didn't. The interesting thing is there's actually still, as far as I know, 8 or 10 states, I haven't kept track in the last 10 years, it's a little Trivial Pursuit things, that actually still have miscegenation laws on the books. And the creepy thing about that is at least 4 of those states are in the Northeast. Massachusetts, I think, still has a miscegenation law. And you have to remember, you can have all sorts of weird laws. As long as you don't apply them, as long as you don't arrest someone and actually try to convict them of that law, then there's no particular reason it's going to get processed. If you want to try this, for example, if you go borrow someone's mule, I know that there's mules over Kaneohe side. If you go bring a mule and you bring it into Honolulu and tie it up at a meet or something like that in downtown Honolulu after 5 in the evening, it's still a $1 fine per day for parking your mule at night in Honolulu. Now, they probably haven't prosecuted anyone for that since probably like the late monarchy period. But the law is still on the books. It's still there. It survived through the territorial period. It survived through statehood. Last I heard, it's still on the books. It's still one of the state laws. As long as HP doesn't arrest someone for tying up their mule after dark, then the law is just going to sort of stay there because it's not being challenged. It's not being processed. So what you find, there's still a few states that actually have miscegenation laws. I saw a recent short blog by a sociologist that pointed out he thinks that there's going to be an increasing push for miscegenation laws to come back into American society. He thinks American society is becoming more conservative in the 2020s, and that there will be an increasing concern about people marrying folks other than folks like themselves, which I find absolutely terrifying, not only from a personal standpoint, but also to suddenly undo about the last 80 years of sort of acceptance. Is sort of terrifying. Now here in Hawaii, interestingly enough, we never had a miscegenation law. And the reason is very simple when you think about it. In the first chunk of the 20th century, say the 1920s, if you look at the system here, the political system, the legal system and everything was run by the Kama'aina. These were your missionary boys, 4th generation, owned pretty much everything that didn't move around here, and were the power brokers. But of course, they're also Papa. They're also part Hawaiian, and despite the fact that they illustrated in most cases very little knowledge about things Hawaiian, in many cases they still liked the fact that they could show that they were in part related to Kamehameha or one of the other Hawaiian sort of royal family members. So you ended up in an interesting situation as the guys that would have written the laws and the guys that would have tried them as judges would have actually been illegal under miscegenation. So by the time of the mid-20s, the early 20s, 30s, in Hawaii, marrying folks other than your own group was actually normative for most of the population here, and actually had been since the missionaries arrived in the 1820s. So you had a society where if you did miscegenation, my guess is maybe 80% of the marriages here would have been annulled. The entire population would have been an OCCC or whatever they had back then. So it just wasn't going to happen. Now so people here didn't really think about it. They weren't bothered. They didn't have a miscegenation law. They probably didn't think about it particularly. But it had huge consequences if you were married and you lived here and you decided you're going to move to the mainland. So if you have a successful career with your significant other, and we'll say that the husband is Portuguese and the wife is Hawaiian Japanese, so they're going to move to Denver. Colorado had miscegenation law, I think, right into the 1950s. So if they moved there in the 1930s, they would have found the minute they got off of I guess it wouldn't be an airplane, the minute they got off the train or whatever, they would have found if someone wanted to, they could have arrested their butts right there on the spot as a felony. Well, they hadn't done anything except marrying someone who was different than themselves. Now, this was not so much used here as a way to discourage migration, but it was used when the mainland talked about why Hawaii should not be a state. One of the huge stereotypes you still get that the mainland has about Hawaii is that we're totally socially different and we don't fit with a value system that is reflective of the US mainland. Now, that's usually in tourism terms couched in the idea that Hawaiian values, and I have no idea what they're talking about, are here. But it's also couched in the fact, for the folks that are slightly more knowledgeable or they want to spin a story, is the population here is all mixed. And in mainland terms, a lot of conservative areas even today, that's not something that thrills people a lot. So Hawaii was seen as a territory, and there were actually discussions in the 1930s, as we'll see, especially as a result of the Massey case, that Hawaii should be deterritorialized and turned into a possession, because it was a place where, since everyone could marry and live with folks other than themselves, everyone in Hawaii was the term they used to use. Everyone in Hawaii was a mongrel, which is sort of like a street dog type thing. And that was a huge, that was actually discussed a lot in US Congress in the 1930s. The only thing that probably stopped that from actually happening was World War II. All of a sudden, the war just sort of, erased a lot of these discussions because there were more important things to talk about. And after World War II, the performance of troops from Hawaii in World War II, and the sort of the propaganda machine of World War II, it was something you didn't really want to revisit. But sad to say, the United States in the 2020s, or at least a significant part of the United States, is probably still bothered by the fact that the majority population here marries folks other than themselves, which is not true in the US mainland. I should point out again, even Chinese in the US mainland don't marry non-Chinese anywhere near the rate they do here. So we are unique in that regard, and it does impact for some folks how they see us, in the sense of see Hawaii. Okay, let me go through these really quickly. These should be pretty straightforward. I've got a little bit, again, the Andrade book is sort of a, I'm not going to get started on that. It's minimally useful, would be the polite way to put it. When you're looking at the key sort of core values in Chinese society, the key thing to remember here, because I'll get into it in a second, is that Chinese values are representative of most of the populations in China, regardless of whether they're ethnically Chinese or ethnically some other group. So this applies just as much to the Cantonese that we see that are the migratory group here in the 19th and early 20th century, as it does to the Chinese that come over post-1970s, 1980s. Even though they speak different dialects, they see themselves as different groups, they still share all these values. And a lot of these values are really, really persistent, even with Chinese Americans here. Much less so to Chinese Americans in the US mainland, where it pretty much becomes a variable from family to family. Some of this I've already gone over, the centrality of family. You identify yourself as a member of a family, you don't identify yourself as an individual. Yeah, okay, I mentioned this last time. This is basically the fact that you can sort of see Chinese families as layer groups. The same generation interacts a lot with each other. They help rear each other, they talk to each other. That's your group that has a tremendous amount of emotional, social support, not cross-generationally. Kids don't hang out with their parents. Parents are would not be at all. In fact, this came up once at a family dinner. One of I think it was my brother-in-law. One of my brother-in-laws was asking something about he'd seen on TV that American parents want their kids to see them as like an older brother or sister, and he was like, what the hell's that about? I mean, he was in his 50s, and he was here since he was like 16. It still made absolutely no sense to him. In Chinese society, you would never see the generation under you as someone you're going to be emotionally, socially close to. There might be a few sort of minor exceptions to that, but your emotional bonds are all within the same generation. So brothers, sisters, cousins, and that are going to be really close, not to aunties and uncles. Your aunties and uncles are going to have their own set of relations with your mom and dad, etc. So it's all generationally. Each generation does their own thing. Each generation has a very powerful, very strong social network. As I think I mentioned before, each generation is going to take care of all their siblings, which would include things like cousins. So you don't have this American thing of the nuclear family, which, if you think about it, is by definition two-generation, parents and kids. And even the extended family you see more typically in, say, Japanese society, which might be parents, grandparents, and kids. And then the interaction is going to be sort of this way. With Chinese society, it's almost like a layer cake, but it's almost like there's little sheets of plastic between the different layers. There's very little interaction across layers, and tremendously powerful interaction within the layer. This is really important to understand if you're ever interacting with Chinese, because they they assume, given the fact that it's their normative system, they sort of assume that everyone else operates this way. And it's a huge source of fascination. For example, at least it was when I first got married with a family. I'm trying to figure out why I didn't interact more with my cousins. You know, and my attitude is, why would I? The attitude is, well, you know, don't you go to like Vegas or do stuff with them? Like, no, why would I? It's like, don't you talk to them every day? No, why would I? So in Chinese society, this is your main social group of bonding, the folks that are the same generation as you. Sex, not quite as much, but even then there is a fair amount of that in terms of genders. In Asian societies, there's a fairly clear gender gap between men and women. Those we'll see gets sort of interesting. Women in Asian societies can actually be very successful. What they do is they take on sort of male gender roles. So this would be the classic example of the Chinese businesswoman who's called the Dragon Empress. She's going to act pretty much like a guy. It's not that she's trying to be a guy, but the roles that she plays in public will be oftentimes, you know, sort of slightly modified version of male roles. And the interesting thing is what you'll find is Chinese guys will treat her the way they would other guys. So they don't treat her in the way that Americans would expect, sort of gender neutral. In Asian societies, if you're female and you're successful, you take on a lot of the male behaviors that successful entrepreneurs or business people or whatever do. And so the interesting thing is the Japanese, or I should say the Chinese, in fact, in Asian societies, they don't see the gender roles as being defined by your physiology. They see the gender roles as being defined by your sort of normative behavioral, you know, identity group in terms of whether you're male or female. So it's very different than the concept of, say, mahu, for example, would be in Hawaiian society, where you have this idea of intermediaries. This isn't an intermediate thing. It's women who, to be successful, take on certain aspects of male roles in public. The interesting thing is what you'll find if they're back in the family, they go back to being, you know, women. Don't see the reverse very much, except in some cases in the arts. Think about it, but that's a small enough population, not worth thinking about. Again, this idea of being successful in education throughout your entire life is the idea that you have to contribute to the family's success. One of the interesting aspects about this is Chinese tend to be really, really practical. As we'll see with Japanese, that's not the case, but Chinese tend to be very, very practical about this. So, for example, if Sarah is, you know, part of a Chinese family, and on one hand they really want her to be a doctor, but she's a really good artist, you know, and by the time she's 12 years old, she's already doing anime comics, and she's already getting you know, people are actually hiring her to write, you know, do panels and do, you know, anime work and stuff like that. She becomes, if people start talking about her in the community, oh, she's really talented. Yeah, you know, she has a real career in this stuff. The family is very likely to drop the doctor dialogue and let her go ahead and pursue her particular skill set, their aptitude that she has. But she'll still have the proviso that she has to be the best anime artist that has ever existed. So the idea that you have to be the best at something persists. But if you've got a tremendous amount of skill in something, Chinese are practical and pragmatic enough. They will, in many cases, let you run with that skill set, because if she's really good at what she does, the family is going to be seen as being highly successful. Here they've got this, you know, member of the family that's a really, you know, renowned artist. Her name shows up and stuff. People talk about her a lot. Oh yeah, you know, she had a showing at this, you know, conference and And so the family's prestige has been enhanced. So what you find is Chinese actually get sort of, in an interesting way, get very practical about this. One of my grandnephews, for example, actually no, it's my nephew, is actually a very good musician, but he's also a very good composer. And even though he's an absolutely superb mathematician, they decided that it didn't make any sense for him to get a PhD in math or go on into IT or something, because he's already, you know, he was at the Boston School of Music as a composer and artist. And so he's already become famous at that. So the family let him do what he wanted to because he's so good at it. They score more points as the family by virtue of letting him follow that track than they would if they'd forced him into something. If, on the other hand, he didn't show any particular aptitude, he probably would have been in IT. So this idea that you have this contribution thing, this is sort of radically different than Japanese and Korean societies, which don't really pay any attention to what your skill set is. They just sort of say, this is what you're going to be. But in Chinese society, there's this very strong sense that the family is going to very practically sort of score folks in terms of where they can best serve the needs of the family, and will oftentimes push them. But there's always this idea that you have to be incredibly good at it. It can't be something you want to do. It has to be something you're very, very good at. So that the pressure you don't lose the pressure. If Sarah were an anime artist and she's in a Chinese family, she's under just as much pressure as she would be to be a doctor or something like that. It's within something she's supposed to be good at, which, if you think about it, can be sort of a double-edged sword. In Asian societies, and this is ironically one of the other stereotypes that makes them, well, let me get that in a second, is that in Asian societies traditionally, this is especially true of Chinese and to a lesser extent Korean society, there's not the idea of individual success, the idea of financial success. So for example, being good at a company, nor is there idea of any sort of like military success. So being good at warfare, for example, is absolutely a negative, in fact. In Asian societies, which you had, to a lesser extent Japanese, but certainly in Chinese and Korean society, the main power group in Asian society is the bureaucracy. And it has been for at least 2,000 years. The Qin dynasty, 221 BC, sets up the bureaucrats as the actual runners of the society. And it's persisted all through. It's exactly the same in 2020 with the Chinese, the People's Republic. Bureaucrats run the society. If you want to be successful in Chinese society, you have to be a bureaucrat. In Chinese society, you become a bureaucrat not because of family, but you become a bureaucrat because you pass the civil service examinations, traditionally. And that's still the same. It's which university you go to in modern China, but it's still the same thing. Educational success means financial success because if you're a bureaucrat, you will be financially successful and you're the power broker. Anything else can be taken from you. And even today in Chinese society, just this last year in 2020, there's been at least 3 of the top billionaires in Chinese society who have everything stripped from them. And they were that was all all their money was taken from them. Everything they owned, they're in prison because the bureaucracy decided they were either doing tax evasion or it was Thursday or whatever it was, and they just lost it. If you're a bureaucrat, you run the society. If you're anything else, especially if you're wealthy and you're not a bureaucrat, you're vulnerable. So for thousands of years, what you've had in Chinese and to a lesser extent in Korean society is that what family needs is scholars. Because if you're a scholar, that means you pass the civil service examination, so become a bureaucrat. So this bottom equation here is exactly how it's seen in Chinese and Korean society. This is why there's enormous pressure in these two societies for kids to do well in school. This is also why in Chinese and actually also in Korean society, but especially Chinese society, there's a fair amount of pressure if you have an aptitude even at something else, that you should probably go into politics because not so much politics, but you should go into the bureaucracy. So you should, go work for the state or the federal government or something like that. So unlike American society, where I think bureaucracy is sort of seen as like the civil service thing, well, you get in the civil service and you can be an idiot, but you're never going to be able to be fired and stuff. So it's sort of like it's not particularly high status. But it doesn't mean you have to work very hard. So it's sort of it's sort of like a gold spoon type thing. In Asian societies, especially Chinese and Korean societies, being the bureaucrat means that you are the power broker. You control everyone else in the society by virtue of being a bureaucrat. So what you had was Chinese coming over here would enormously pressure their kids. Even if they were on the plantation, the kids are going to public school. Think of those pictures we saw last week. Those kids are under enormous pressure to be really good in school, not only for bragging rights for the family, but so they can basically go into the upper systems of the other parts of the system, which in the Chinese view are bureaucracy. Now that changes. The Chinese move here in Hawaii and stay here and move on to the US mainland to other areas. But the idea that you have to be successful by virtue of education is still, mainstream with Chinese and Koreans in the United States. Now, this is one of the reasons why if you go to many Chinese universities, and a fair number you would fit into this, if you were to apply to many mainland American universities to a grad school, in many cases you'll find that even though you have the top scores, you might not get admitted because many grad schools say that Asian Americans are overrepresented in graduate programs. So they actually intentionally don't allow as many of them in because they would otherwise take over the entire program. So, Harvard's MBA program, for example, has a limit on the number of Asian Americans that are allowed into it, because otherwise they have the highest educational scores, and they would pretty much the entire program would be, Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, etc. Americans. So they don't allow them that. So you end up in the irony that Asians, in many cases, when it comes to higher education, especially secondary, like specialty, like master's and PhD programs, find themselves with a negative stereotype. They're too good in school. They're too good as students. And so therefore you have to watch to make sure they don't dominate graduate programs. And you see the stereotype having happened, especially being amplified in the last couple of years with the American fear of Chinese graduate students, in the sense of folks from China coming over here as transfer students, or coming over here for advanced programs, that they're going to dominate the school. So you end up with, there was fear that I think it was MIT's IT program was going to end up being look like a branch of a Chinese university, because all the students were going to be from China. And never mind the fact that they had by far the highest scores educationally. So if you're picking people in their intellectual abilities or their ambition, they were a logical group. But what you find is Asian Americans still are stereotyped as being the group that's going to be best in school because they're the most motivated. This is less true here, but for example, if you guys were in grade school or high school and you went to the US mainland and you're Asian, you look Asian, I should say, it's in many cases you'd find that your teachers on the mainland would expect you automatically to be better in science and math, just by virtue of what you look like or what your last name sounds like, compared to your classmates. So what you end up is still today, in fact, it seems to be getting stronger, is the sort of a negative pushback against the Asian desire to be successful in education, which isn't that a kid's good in math, he's just been studying 4 to 6 hours a night, and his classmates might have been doing it for 15 minutes, and then went on to play, I don't know what the game is this year, went on to their computers to play something. So, it's a reflection of time spent, but that's not the way it's stereotyped. It's stereotyped as a very racial type of thing, that Asians are always better at education. Now, what that means, among other things, is if you're Asian and you don't do well in things like math or science, especially on the mainland, teachers and other stuff are not going to be sympathetic. They're going to think that you're just slacking off, that you have an aptitude and you're wasting it. They're not going to see that maybe you just don't understand. So there's still a lot of these, especially on the mainland, ironically, what is on one hand a strongly held value in the system. And of course, in larger Anglo-American society, the fact that Asians are good in education or committed to doing well in education is seen as a positive. It also comes back and slaps them. Sort of like a you can't win type situation. And part of this is and it's an important thing in Chinese society. I think this was true in Korean society, but to be honest, I don't remember. Certainly true in Chinese society. In Chinese society, this is very different than any place else I know of. If my father, for example, was a successful bureaucrat, which also means he can, if he's high enough up, he becomes the nobility. So he becomes the, mayor of a city, and I can't remember what that term is in Chinese society. But that means even when he retires, he keeps that title. I don't get to inherit any of that. I have to take the civil service exams like everyone else. I have to succeed in the civil service exam, and I have to walk through the system. If anything, his success might work against me, because people that know him, one, can diss on me because they didn't like him, say, but also because if he was successful, they'll have high expectations that I should be as too, so there'll be a higher parameter set. The only place I can think you see this in American system, in American society, might be with sports. If you're the son of someone who was good at football or something like that, then I would think that there's probably, in fact, I know there's a fair amount of pressure that, when you get into the same sport, you should manifest something from your parent. Very much the sociobiology thing that Americans are sort of into in weird ways. But in Chinese society, every generation had to make their own way in the world. And that's why every society had to be good in school. Because every society had to do well educationally. Every generation had to do well educationally. Every generation had to pass civil service exams. Every generation had to be bureaucrats if you were going to be successful. You didn't inherit anything. And if you think about it, that's totally different than in Europe. In Europe, you inherit success. If your dad was somebody and beat the crap out of people and became the Duke of Norfolk or something like that in England, then that title's inherited by the kids. The kids can basically drool on the ground and be total idiots but they're going to inherit the title. And the British royal family is sort of a good case in point. You know, they have no skill set. They just inherited it because in Chinese society, even the imperial family was very frequently erased. Every couple of hundred years, you just sort of gut the entire system and a whole new family would come into power. So everything in Chinese society in terms of status and prestige is generationally specific and transient or temporary. And what this means is each generation couldn't expect to be supported by their parents. You couldn't live on your parents' reputation, your parents' name, your parents' this or that, which probably then reinforces again the sort of generational segregation that you see in Chinese society. But that also means there's this constant push to be successful. Every individual, every group, every generation has to try just as hard, if not harder, than their parents. Probably the biggest difference with Chinese and Anglo-American society is the fact that Chinese society didn't have an idea of visible manifestations of success. Now, if you think about it, our whole Calvinist Puritan thing I went through, I think, a couple of weeks ago, one of the big things on that is if you're successful, you should have a big house and all the things that show success so that you can show to everyone else you're successful and therefore, you know, more morally superior. And you should make other people jealous so that they'll be motivated to be work hard and become morally superior like you. Chinese don't have that. In fact, if you go to someplace like Hong Kong, which I'm familiar with, if you go to Hong Kong, for example, you find the really wealthy neighborhoods like Happy Valley, which is incredibly expensive. You'll find a lot of the houses are actually behind really crappy looking walls. So whereas in the United States, if you're talking about Portlock or Black Point or something like that, you find these, you know, beautiful manicured lawns and outsides and, you know, fancy gates and the whole 9 yards. Very typical in Hong Kong. It's also true in Xi'an, that you'll find very wealthy areas actually have very ugly looking outsides. They don't want anyone outside of the family to know how much power and wealth the family has. So it's hidden behind gates, it's hidden behind walls. They don't want to make noise about it. In particular situations, they will. All of a sudden, you'll see someone, you know, out of a really crappy wall and a really, you know, it's an expensive neighborhood, some bang, and here's a Bentley with a driver. And someone in the back seat, he's got like a $150,000 watch on his wrist, and obviously the car's worth, you know, God knows how much. But he's going somewhere, but he's not interested in you seeing him per se. I mean, he's certainly not interested in knowing who he is. He's going somewhere where the people he hangs out with will be impressed with who he is. So he's trying to push the good gossip with his peer group, if you want to. So in that situation, what you find in Chinese society is because you're afraid of the bureaucracy, because the Chinese system, and in fact, all Asian societies, do not have a concept of a legal system. Asian societies traditionally didn't have legal systems. You had sets of laws, but those were applied arbitrarily by bureaucrats. And this is still true in China in 2020. The Chinese government has a legal system, but the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government can arbitrarily decide how they're going to do stuff. So just because there's a law that says that they can't do something to you, for example, that you've got rights, that doesn't mean squat in China. They can do whatever they want to you. And that's because they're bureaucrats, and bureaucrats make the laws and bureaucrats interpret the laws. So there's no idea of an overarching legal system which everyone has to abide by. So in that situation, since you don't have a legal system like that, if you drive around in a fancy car, say a couple hundred years ago, you're in a fancy carriage and you got a lot of stuff and it's really visible, there's a good bet that there's going to be at least 2 or 3 bureaucrats that don't like that because they think that it should be theirs. I have no idea why. And because of the way the system works, they can just basically take it from you. They'll either kill you, throw you on the street, and just strip you of everything you own, you know, sell your family into slavery, whatever it might be. And at that point, you've lost it all. So being wealthy and being visibly wealthy in Chinese society was never a positive. In fact, it was incredibly risky. The only folks that could afford to be seen as being wealthy are the bureaucrats, because they're the ones that enforce the laws that they make up. So in that situation, about the only thing that you generally couldn't have taken from you in most cases was land. So in Chinese society, you would not invest in stuff. You would not invest in gold. You wouldn't invest in jade or whatever else it might be. What you're going to do is you're going to buy a property. And so what you do with that property is then you put it in the hands of your relatives, your brothers and sisters, your nieces and nephews, your sons and daughters. If you can, if you're really wealthy, you go and you give each of them a piece of property. And the attitude is that's the one thing that the government and the legal system can't take from you, is land. And in Chinese society, most of your civil wars that have resulted in Chinese society have been because governments try to do that and try to take the property. And eventually, the whole place blows up. So land is seen as like the only safe investment if you're Chinese. Now, you see this in two ways. Now, I'll give you an example because this just came up as a discussion a couple of days ago with my wife. She was talking about a small, I don't know if you call nail places beauty salons. I'm going to call it a beauty salon. It's a place that does nails, manicures. And the lady that owns one of these small shops, she's Chinese. She migrated over here about 30 years ago. She's from Hong Kong. Now she only has a little shop. I think it has like 3 or 4 people. And so it's, a typical manicure place, just chairs and people going to have their nails done or whatever the hell you do in a manicure shop. Very typically Chinese. She owns 7 pieces of property on Oahu. She has 3 kids. Each of her kids has their own house and has their own property. The other ones she stashed away. So she doesn't have to work anymore. She's in her 50s. You don't make that much money at a manicure shop. But you literally pour every penny you make into buying property. You don't buy a nicer car. You don't do this or that. You put it into land, and to a lesser extent, houses. And that's still very, very much part of the Chinese system. It's very typically with 3rd and 4th generation, even 5th generation Chinese here, for them to be very, very big on owning multiple pieces of real estate. It's very typical if you go down to Chinatown, little Chinese, restaurants, little Chinese, little goofy hole in the wall places, own tons of property here. I have no idea how much property the folks that own Royal Kitchen have, but I know it's at least 12 pieces of property. 2 of them are in Black Point. So you have a little tiny, half-assed restaurant the size of my office. And, in a Western sense, that's like, that's that far away from starvation or failure. And you look and you realize these families have poop. That's because land is the only safe thing to invest in. And so what you do is you don't leave your children money. You leave your children land and a house. And if possible, multiple houses or multiple pieces of land. So there's one they live in, the other ones they can then invest or something like that. Now, on one hand, to the Anglo-American society, this is really impressive because it shows, again, this huge, their view of the sort of Puritan work ethic, which of course it isn't to the Chinese. But on the other hand, it also, of course, becomes a negative, just like the education thing. You see this a lot, for example, in California, in Northern California, where there was a persistent pattern from the 1870s on. In fact, you guys saw a video on that. They didn't want Chinese to own land because they were too good at it. In an Anglo-American society, on one hand, you want other folks to emulate you, but the last thing you want them to do is kick your ass. So you want them to emulate you, but be remembered that they're always second. They're not as good at you at it. So Chinese, ironically, because they were so good at land acquisition, so willing to sacrifice for it, that that became unacceptable, ironically, to Anglo-American society. That on one hand had as a positive, until you take it to the extent that you're actually better at it than Anglo-Americans were. So it's still somewhat of a pressure. You frequently see this with especially right-wing politicians in the U.S. mainland. They'll talk about how Chinese are trying to buy up everything. And they'll frequently just sort of roll in, Chinese investors in 2020 with Chinese families that have been here for, say, 130 years, or in the mainland, 150 years. They just sort of see it as the same thing. And it's a very convenient argument because I think with Anglo-American society, there is sort of a stereotype that Chinese are actually too good at real estate. And so at some point you should control them. The other part of this, and this is probably really sort of striking, this is changing a little bit because the Chinese political climate right now in 2020 is really strange. It's never been this way in the last 2,000 years that I know of under Xi Jinping. So assuming that they grow out of this weird phase soon. And what you find about Chinese society that's really interesting is whereas most groups tend to see that if you're part Chinese, you're somehow diluted. Or I should say, if you're part of that group, you're not as much. So for example, Irish Americans, if they go back to Ireland, find that the Irish don't really see that they're quite the same because they haven't gone through the experiences the Irish have gone through in, say, the 20th century or the 21st century, or they're trying to get independence from England, etc. So therefore, they haven't really, and especially if they're only part, say, 1/4 Irish or something like that. So like, well, you're not really Irish. That's not picking on the Irish. That's typical of almost every group. Chinese have just the opposite. In Chinese society, even if you're part Chinese, so those of you, for example, there might be 1 or 2 folks in class that are maybe like 1/16 Chinese. As far as the Chinese are concerned, in China, that means that you're still Chinese. So Chinese take even very small portions of being Chinese as actually making you Chinese. So they sort of reverse this sort of sociobiology thing. They take the sort of racial purity thing and entirely ignore it. Now, of course, this is also incredibly useful if you're Chinese in China, because you figure if you're part Chinese and you're living in Silicon Valley, for example, that means you should have some money to send back to the family. So there's, pretty mercenary practical reasons for this. But it's really sort of fascinating because I don't know of another group that does this to the extent the Chinese do. You can be 1/4, 1/16, or something like that, and Chinese in China will actually see you, depending on what your last name is, as far as they're concerned, your family. They're not interested in the fact that, maybe only one of your 4, grandparents is Chinese. That doesn't make any difference to them. So this very inclusionary way of looking at who's actually Chinese makes it really complicated scenario, because if you think about it, that means that a large number of Chinese, especially in the US mainland and here, but supposed to be more so here, are actually Hapa. They're not pure Chinese. And for a lot of the other ethnic groups, how much of that group you are is a real important criteria whether you're actually part of that group. With Chinese, it's just the opposite. Any part means you're included. So, again, Chinese society and its value system is really radically different than the Anglo-American one. And the irony, if you think about it, is again, an Anglo-American society would make a great noise about how inclusionary is really good. This is what you should do. It's very politically correct in the 21st century. But the Chinese don't care about political correctness. This is just some way they've been doing for thousands of years. Okay, there's a second group of Chinese. I want to finish up with this. And this is the Chinese that come over after World War II, or more accurately after the Korean War, or during and after the Korean War. And what you find is sort of there's two parts to this, and maybe the best way to figure this is after World War II. World War II is a real striking phenomena in terms of the way that minorities get treated. For some minorities, African American, for example, it really didn't result in a lot of change that I think they thought it would. This is one reason why there were big African American riots in a lot of cities during World War II during the draft. With Japanese Americans, you find them totally, well, in large part, put into segregated units. For other groups, like, for example, Chinese and such like that, they weren't put in segregated units. There were no Chinese military units. Chinese were just stuck with whatever group they were. So the various military groups, like the 25th Division, that was largely, at least part from here, had large numbers of local Chinese in it. So what you find for the first time is for a lot of folks on the US mainland, they're suddenly bumping into minorities in the same unit, in a situation where they're supposed to work together, fight together, maybe even die together. And this was really hard for folks in the mainland to deal with, I think, in a lot of ways. But it also sort of, this forced assimilation of the military, I think, made a huge change in sort of mainstream American society in terms of people realizing that the stereotypes they had of each other weren't at all accurate. And you have to remember, stereotypes can be so powerful because you don't check them against accuracy. There's sort of a classic example, which you might call fake news. So the stereotypes that people had of Chinese, as they had of a lot of Asians, when they actually started dealing with Chinese, they realized that the stereotypes were either inaccurate or they were exaggerations. And what you had was just someone who was just a person. So what you find is that two things occurs. One is there's more acceptance, though less on the mainland than here. Secondly is, especially here, prior to World War II, but especially after World War II, the local Chinese population here, you're now third and fourth generation by then, become really, really successful. They do well out of World War II, and they do really, really well after World War II. They jump into, for example, tourism, modern tourism, in a really big way. And so what happens is they become really powerful and big power brokers here. In the mainland American society, what happens is, on one hand, there's more acceptance of Chinese, sort of, but there's still a lot of these stereotypes of, like the Chinatown and the Chinese speaking funny English and wearing cues and stuff like that, which persist right down to today. You can still see these stereotypes a lot if you go to, say, San Francisco's Chinatown. So what happens is, in the US mainland, what happens is Asians are pretty much told, if you want to be accepted in American society, we'll let you in, which they hadn't prior to World War II, but you're going to have to assimilate completely. So Chinese Americans in the US mainland have to become Asian Americans. So they get out of the practice of celebrating Chinese things and doing Chinese stuff. It's very interesting if you go to the US mainland to see that relatively few Chinese, for example, in the mainland, go to Buddhist temples or do anything or know anything about Buddhism at all. Relatively few of them celebrate Chinese New Year's. Very rarely in the U.S. mainland would you see the door guards that you see on the outside of doors, like I got outside of my office or at home. Very rarely would you see these in the front of doors, because you don't want to draw attention to yourself, because the rest of the population in your neighborhood, if it's a suburb, would look at that stuff and say, whoa, what type of person is living there? Like, they got these weird characters on their door. You know, what does that mean? That's sort of creepy. So what you find is Chinese Americans in the U.S. mainland have to become invisible. They can't hide the fact they look Asian, but in every other way, shape, and form, they're supposed to be, you know, as uber American as possible. Here, they don't have to do that because they're so successful economically and sort of socially, politically, that they pretty much can do their own thing, and they actually become a major power force here. The Fongs are a good example, Hiram Fong's family. Well, until they got into lawsuits with each other. So that's sort of a, you know, there's a very different view of being Chinese here versus the Chinese mainland. After the 1960s, in 1966, the U.S. changed its immigration laws. Prior from the, I think, start of the 20th century, I don't know, maybe Andrade mentions this, till 1966, there was a set of laws in place that actually restricted how many people could come from different places. I believe from Asia was either 250 or 300 Asians were allowed in from all of Asia legally. Ironically, if you were British, there was never a quota. So American society, on the one hand, it had that whole Statue of Liberty and the plaque down there. But what it didn't have, sort of a small subtext on that, was we want the right types of people. And their view of the right type of people was basically Anglo, English, to a lesser extent, Scottish and Irish and Welsh. Though actually Irish were pretty much dissed on right into the 1960s too. And other groups were, you know, okay. French were okay. Germans were really good. Italians, not really. Greeks, not really. So what you find is American society was really big on being very picky with folks that would be called haole. And there were actually quotas to the number of Italians and Greeks allowed into the United States right into this 1966, when that quota thing was snapped or erased. Then they started to get a major increase in Chinese moving into the United States, originally from Hong Kong, Macau. And that's largely because of the political turmoils that were going on in China and also in Hong Kong under British rule. Also Taiwan in this period, which was undergoing a huge amount of turmoil. Singapore, just because they weren't sure if Singapore was still going to be around. So after 1966, there's fairly significant increases, pretty rapidly escalating, in terms of Chinese coming into Hawaii and into the mainland United States. Fair number of the Chinese that move into the mainland United States then secondarily move to Hawaii. For the very simple reason that they realize very quickly, if they're on the mainland, they're going to have to uber assimilate really quickly, and they don't want to. They see nothing wrong with being Chinese, especially if you're from Hong Kong, which is a pretty sophisticated place. You know, you're going to be pretty low tolerance to someone saying, well, you know, you're Chinese, and they're like, what? You know, so a fair amount of that group actually ends up moving to Hawaii. Or to areas like San Francisco, where you had a large enough Chinese enclave, they could pretty much, you know, ignore this outside attitude. The second group that radically as a change occurs after 1990. Mainland China, the People's Republic of China, the big China, in the 1970s go through this huge political change. You end up with a new China, basically, into the 80s and 90s. One of the side effects of that is by the early 1990s, you could actually leave China. That's when a fair amount, like some members of my in-laws actually came over post-1990 as mainland Chinese. And initially, this is as individuals, and this goes, as I've got here, from basically 1990 to basically about 2012, 2015. Individuals who would come over here, they either feel like they don't fit necessarily particularly well in Chinese society, maybe for economic reasons. There's real career opportunities here they can't get, you know, whatever it might be. So these are sort of individual choices. Oftentimes, these folks are usually coming over as families, so they're not coming over as single individuals. So it isn't like the plantation period where you got a bunch of, you know, teens and 20-somethings coming over by themselves. This is usually family groups, a little bit older, oftentimes with kids, who are moving over here as a nuclear family or maybe a small extended family for a whole slew of different reasons. Now, you have to remember there's a really radical difference. This group is not coming from Zhongshan. A few of them do. But the vast majority of these folks coming over post-1990 are coming over from mainland China. So they're actually Han Chinese. So they're coming here from Shanghai, from Beijing, from Guangzhou somewhere, whatever. Or I should say from Zhongshan, well, not Zhongshan per se, but Guangzhou. So most of them are actually ethnically Chinese. Now, one of the side effects is, of course, when they get here, they can't speak to the Cantonese. because they speak, basically different languages. So this new group finds themselves, on one hand, there's a bunch of Chinese living here, but especially if they're third, fourth, fifth generation Chinese, they don't speak, Cantonese much at all. They sure as hell don't speak Han. So this group finds a lot of people who look like them, but don't necessarily act like them in a lot of ways. The last group, I guess I'm going to have to finish this up a few minutes next time, is mainland Chinese investors. After 2012, the Chinese political system allows Chinese to take out more money. Prior to this, you could only take out, like, I think, $50,000 if you were going to move somewhere. After that, you're allowed to take out pretty much as much as you want. There's a lot of shell games that go on. So what happens is you start to see a massive increase in the number of Chinese that are buying things in Hawaii, and especially, again, this idea of land. So by especially 2014, 2015, you see large numbers of Chinese coming in with basically suitcases full of money, buying up anything that stands still long enough to be bought. Two reasons for that. One is Hawaii is seen as a very good investment area because it's seen as very stable, which means that the real estate prices are seen globally as being very stable, so you're not going to lose your money. And secondly is also the fact that for many Chinese, this is certainly true in 2020, they're really afraid that the Chinese economic system is going to go belly up. It's very, very fragile, and everyone's sort of waiting for it to just do a crash and burn. And so they want to get as much of their money outside of China before this all happens. And they're very aware of the Chinese bubble that occurred in the 1990s and the other Chinese bubble in around 2003 when huge parts of the Japanese economy just went for boom, especially real estate. So the Chinese are very aware that's going to happen in China. It's just a matter of what day, what week. So again, buying things in Hawaii makes a lot of sense. So you're not going to necessarily ask what the price is because you're more concerned about getting the money out of China rather than what you're going to get out of it here. Now, this has made for a huge stereotype of Chinese in the last, say, 10 years, which is Chinese are just loaded with cash and they'll buy anything. And there's a certain amount of truth, but I don't think people understand the pressure behind it. So we'll stop with that because I've really got one or two more things I got to mention here. But that should sort of catch us up. Did all that make a fair amount of sense, or was it all sort of uber confusing?
It was
That was
good.
pretty good.
Okay.
Made sense.
Good.
Yeah.
If you don't deal with Chinese a lot, once the COVID thing gets a little less silly, I would strongly recommend you go down to Chinatown. Chinatown is absolutely fascinating because what you'll find is the buildings are owned by local Chinese. So the buildings have been owned since early 20th century in many cases. The folks that actually you will see in Chinatown very rarely are local Chinese. I know that even with my relatives who are Chinese, and some of the faculty here who are Chinese, I go into Chinatown, well, I don't right now, but I go into Chinatown usually every week. So I actually get a list from my relatives who don't like to go to Chinatown because it's full of Chinese to go and pick up stuff for them, which is sort of bizarre when you think about how the guys going into Chinatown to buy stuff because I know everyone down there. But the interesting thing is most of the shopkeepers that I deal with are actually recent migrants from China. So what you'll find is the folks that own the stores are not the same ethnic group as the folks that are in the stores who are either Chinese or Vietnamese. And those are recent migrants. So the folks in Chinatown are not the same group that runs Chinatown, but in many cases, they're all Chinese. And that's, in fact, with my relatives who are from China, they refuse to buy stuff made in China, including food, which gets me in trouble sometimes because I like Chinese stuff, but go figure. So yeah, so some weird side effects of all this sort of attitude about what type of Chinese are you. Okay, if we're all good on that, then I would recommend stay out of Chinatown right now because pretty much everything's closed down. But I guess if that's it, are there any questions?
I did have one question. When was our Pololo project due with our partners?
You mean the actual final project part?
Yes.
Near the end of the semester. If you go into Canvas, it should be near the end somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
would suggest that hopefully by now, I've only seen one or two groups get back to me. Everyone had better, I think I told everyone I'll do it by today. If I get a chance, I'll do it this afternoon. You have better figured out what it is within your theme that you actually want to do. So send a set of particulars out. And then make sure that everyone in your group agrees with that. And I would say get started by this week. In some cases, it'll be pretty straightforward. In other cases, there might be a big learning curve. And I don't think you're going to know there's a problem until you try to do it and you realize you're not sure how to. As I think I mentioned with the groups I already contacted, I don't expect you guys to have to figure out how to make this stuff work. I'll do training sessions for you guys and show you what I want you to or how to get it. But you guys have to do the grunt labor. So the sooner you guys get started and at least poking around and figuring out what you want to look at, the sooner you can figure out what it is you need help on. And if not, then you just get the bugger done. You know, I mean, this is a short semester. Everything's POW in what, a month and a week or something like that? The semester ends on November 25th. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, you can't pace yourself out like a normal semester because there ain't no time. So my suggestion would be get this stuff done as soon as possible. Because I don't know what you're doing in your other classes, but I can tell you got a ton of work that's going to show up in November, and you guys are going to be up to your eyeballs in crap. So you don't want to have this. A lot of this stuff, everything you guys are doing is pretty time intensive. So, you know, whether it be reading stuff, like the guys doing the geology part, or if you're doing the neighborhood stuff, actually looking at houses and trying to inventory values and, you know, what you're going to look at. It's going to take time, and you've got to set aside the time where you got a little time. You know, so do it now.
Okay, thank you.
Professor,
Yeah.
So you said that we as groups are supposed to choose themes. So the email that you sent out, like, assigned us our parts of the project. Do you mean a theme, like, aside from that?
Sorry, a particular thing within the theme. Yeah, so each of them, I think I had a set of numbered options. Pick one of those options.
Okay. Okay, I get it.
So I think you wanted to look at streams or something. So I think I gave you, or there was something that had to do with I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, I think mine is tracing the pollution through.
Because there was a bunch of articles. Yeah, there's a bunch of articles that I haven't even looked. I mean, I got them, and there's probably a hell of a lot more out there. So in many cases, if you guys see stuff, that isn't all that's out there. That's all that basically I could do with basically a 4 to 6 hour search on Google. So that is
this like an essay-based project?
No. I don't want an essay. What I want is as much information as you can get. Try to write it up in a coherent fashion. But no, this isn't like a paper. So what I need is everything you guys find. Now remember, and actually that's a good point. Remember, one of the things that's really important when we're doing research, remember this is new research, is when you look at stuff and there isn't anything there, that's just as important as when you look at stuff and you find stuff. So for example, if you're looking at stream pollution, you go to like DLNR and you find they've got absolutely nothing about stream pollution. Make a note of the fact that you couldn't find anything, because if you think about it, that's forestry's in DLNR. And how the hell could you be forestry, which owns the entire back of that valley, and have no clue or interest in what the stream pollution is? Now, I don't know, I would assume they do, but you'd be amazed how often places that should have something don't. So what you don't find when you think you're going to find something is in some cases as important as the stuff you do look for. So in all cases, this is discovery. I've given you, in many cases, sources or places to start. For those of you doing the inventory, the houses inventories, I think it's the neighborhoods thing. I've given you that form that the state uses. We're probably you might have to go over and help me, me help you how we want to define that. I've actually got a guy that I think is going to write me up something on that. But you need to start looking at that, because it might be that there's something we're totally missing. For example, if you're looking at houses in Palolo, I sort of have a feeling that fences and walls are a big thing in terms of property fences and walls, but that's entirely intuitive because I used to live in Palolo. I have no idea if that's true. There might be other things I totally missed, like maybe the color of houses, or, I have no idea. If you start to
I actually live in Palolo right now, so I right my backyard.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I used to live up Waimau Road. So, so I mean, it's what you see and patterns you see that aren't written up are just as realistic, because no one's done this before. You guys are the first ones with all this stuff. No one's done a project like this in Hawaii on any neighborhood. And they're very rare. They tend to do it more in Europe than they do in Hawaii, in the United States. So, you guys are literally the first group doing this. So anything you find that your intuition, or you think, this sort of looks like it might be something, it might not turn out to be, but you got to keep a track of all that stuff. Don't depend on your memory, because your memory's if your memory's like mine, at 10 seconds, it's gone. We got memories like gerbils.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Any other questions about that? But do start thinking about it. Do start poking around a little bit. If you decide that you want to, don't procrastinate on it, because it's a time It takes time. It's not something procrastination is a good idea. Procrastinate on term papers. Don't procrastinate on this.
Okay, so it's not really like MLA formatting or essay.
No.
Formatting. It's just
No.
kind of information down.
At some point, Candace and I are probably gonna have to take all this crap, hopefully with some of the St. Louis folks, and write it up into something.
Okay, so just more mostly information then.
Yeah,
altogether.
try to organize it in whatever way makes sense to you.
Right.
But if anything, always err inside of too much detail. Don't ever gloss over something. If you say that I think people with yellow houses always have walls, then try to keep track of it. You know, and it's tally on the side, start to keep track. Oh, I saw 17 yellow houses and all 17 had walls. You know, I don't know what it's going to be for each of you. But you know, use your brains are there to be used, and this is the type of project where you're using your brains. So, you know, so listen to what your brain's telling you. Okay, we all good on all that?
Oh yeah, I think we're good.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, on that note,